Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Triangle Arts Association Artist Interview Series. My name is Violet. I am the intern at the current residency program, and also joining us today is the current artist in residence, Latrelle Rostant. And Latrelle Rostant is a textile artist currently based between Maryland and New York, and a resident at the Triangle Arts Association during our fall 2021 and winter cycle. Latrelle utilizes a lot of modular looms in order to create very unconventional weavings, in order to explore material experimentation and subvert normative expectations of woven objects. She was born in Trinidad and Tobago and has studied textiles in the Art Institute of Chicago and Rhode Island School of Design. Her work revolves around not only the woven textiles, but also the idiosyncratic tools designed to create them. And thank you so much for joining us, Latrelle.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on some of the connections that you have to your own personal history and sort of how those experiences, as an immigrant navigating different cultural spaces, are brought into your experimentation with woven textiles, sort of how those intertwine?
For me, I spent my childhood in Trinidad, and when my mother and I sort of moved up here, we moved around a lot. We initially came and lived in New York, and then due to circumstances, we ended up in Maryland, and then North Carolina, and then I ended up back in Maryland. So when I first came here, it was very much, going from, a pretty, regular life to sort of this life in which I was constantly moving. There wasn't like a really set place in which I lived. And then, in terms of my adult life here in the States, I've tend to sort of never really settle down particularly in one space. I find as I look back, I'm constantly moving, whether it's moving for school or moving for work. And I think I've eventually, looking back and looking at the work I've made, I've sort of realized in all these different spaces I've occupied, I've sort of had to adapt myself into those spaces in terms of never really having a set way of how I occupy those spaces, because for some reason or the other, it's never permanent. And I think, when you sort of live that sort of life in which you're moving from one place to another, for me personally, I think I got to a point where I started looking back and trying to recall a lot of my own understanding of my culture from when I was a child, because I think when you're a child, you just observe and you take in, but you don't really understand the context in which these cultural happenings are happening. And for me as an adult, I felt I wanted to sort of understand that more. And as I sort of looked back and I re-engaged with the culture of Trinidad, especially carnival culture, I sort of started to question how I understood myself in that space versus how I understood myself living in United States, and just sort of I sort of came to an understanding of, even though I was born in Trinidad and that is my culture, I always felt like I didn't quite fit in anymore. Like the places were familiar, but things had changed. But even though I was from there, I wasn't from there anymore because of this sort of distancing that happened through my leaving and living in the States. But even living in the States, and even though I've spent the majority of my life here, there's this cultural part of myself that isn't present in a way that it can be present when you exist in a space in which you are culturally tied to. And I think I got to a point where I really wanted to understand, how do I understand myself? How do I contextualize myself within the world in which I occupied and the world, the spaces I moved through? And I sort of tried to figure that out through making, and my method of making is textiles and weaving. And I sort of went from this period of just making these very beautiful dimensional texture textiles to really wanting to understand why I was making it that way, and why, and um, what was the not only the prompt, but what was these objects and how were they operating, and how does that relate to how I was understanding and viewing and taking a lot of the things I was sort of interacting and moving by. And this way of making is truly a search or a desire to sort of make in a way and make things that sort of reflect on how I am trying to place myself in a world in which I can't really place myself. Yeah.
Yeah. And also in past interviews, and you've mentioned a dichotomy between your architectural work and your textile work. And can you sort of elaborate on that relationship between the individual spaces that textiles kind of create for us, and then the communal spaces that architecture create, and how they sort of coalesce in your work?
Yeah. So there was a period in time when I decided to pursue architecture as a degree. And for me, they both sort of related to sort of interaction of space in very similar ways. The interaction of the body and space, and like textiles is something in which the body enters and occupies, and depending on the materiality, the structure of the textiles, the body interacts with the textiles in different way. And I sort of saw a lot of similarities between that and architecture, and how how materials, placement of materials, the forming of shape, to sort of really inform how we interact with those spaces. And textiles and the interaction is sort of like one-on-one, but it's one-on-one that depending on site, depending on intent, it could be something that's very communal through color, through shape, through form. And for me, architecture was just sort of, it was sort of the same approach to making, but the materiality was different in terms of the I think the materiality was different, but they sort of were doing the same things, but at different scales. And for me, that at the time, it just sort of, when I decided to sort of go forward and pursue architecture, I was sort of thinking they were the same things. But as I pursued my education through architecture, textiles always seem to come through in different ways, in terms of how I was looking at the materiality of how I was making my objects, and sort of the prompts that really spoke to me. I sort of would work them through processes and materials and techniques that are very textile based. And at the end of my studies, I sort of came to the conclusion that while my education in architecture was very informative, it was not something that I wanted to pursue in the sort of the ways that I knew at the time. And for me, architecture, it's something that, and that education is something that I'm still trying to process through, but it's something that in very subtle ways have worked their way back into textiles. And it's sort of one of the most obvious ways is just sort of the modular loom that I sort of designed and developed. I feel that if it wasn't for my exposure to architecture and the things that I sort of learned through that field, I don't think I would have made the leap I needed to make in sort of the desired and the understanding that, you know, in order for me to make the thing I wanted to make, I have to make the tool that will allow me to make the things that I wanted to make. And I understand that, you know, architecture was the thing that allowed me to make that leap.
Yeah, it gave you that opportunity and that sort of background and everything like that. And how do you think the creation of, you know, this new tool has sort of transformed your understanding and, you know, relationship to, you know, traditional weaving, like the weaving you might have learned and beforehand been associated with?
I think in the beginning, when I started making these weavings, I was making on, you know, a frame loom, and you know, there was a lot of, you know, the making was happening, but there's like this slow understanding and realization that the tool was not allowing me, the tool at hand was not allowing me to make in the way that I wanted to make. And I thought, you know, it was something that could be resolved, you know, in ways and sort of, you know, the materiality of the understructure. I could like incorporate other materials rather than traditional materials. And that would allow me to sort of build this understructure to create these forms and shapes. And, you know, I got to a point where I I realized like the color and the colors I was using and the beading I was doing at the time and sort of the wire understructure was sort of a distraction from what I really wanted to do. And once I removed the color and I sort of made a decision to use a very particular type of material that I could sort of, this rope-like material that I could sort of deconstruct. And it sort of had sort of like this plain natural color. Like it really forced me to look at what I was doing, what my hand was doing and what I was observing in the making. And you know, it's always in those moments of frantic making where you're just like, oh, I need to get this done. You just want to make, but you know, it really came down to like the slowing down and looking. And it wasn't until like one night I was in my studio and I was like basically doing these acrobats with this frame loom. And I was like, why are you making in this way? Like, why are you forcing this tool? Why are you fighting with this tool? Like, if you want to do certain things, you're going to have to make your own tool. And there's like literally like that, a series of thoughts like that. It just sort of like, well, you keep doing this way and you're constantly frustrated and you've removed all these other things. You removed this understructure and you're really trying to look at what you're just doing with these, you know, these materials of cotton. And I sort of was like thinking and I was sitting there and I was looking at what was happening on this tool and I was like, you will never get what you need from the tools at hand because if you were able to, you would be making on those tools. But, you know, it's clear that those tools were not going to allow me to do what I wanted to do. And my next thought was like, you have to make this tool. You have to make this tool. Like you're the maker. And in order for you to make what you want to make, you know what you need. So therefore you have to design and make the tool that allow you to have the freedom to really make the way you want it to make, to really move forward in the way that allows you to move closer to really what you want to make. And I felt I spent a considerable amount of time like making the tool, getting the tool, because the first iteration of the tool I had someone else make it. Like I designed it, but then I had someone else make it. And it then became a situation of I had to wait to get this tool. And by the time I got it, I immediately started to work on it. And I immediately know that what I had thought and what I had made was not going to allow me to do what I wanted to do. It was like, oh no, you, like me as the maker, I have to make it. I have to understand, because I understand what I need. And from when I started making the tool is when I really started to um, make the parts I needed to make this modular loom. And once I was sort of able to control and sort of understand that, I was able to quickly like see things that were what was working and what was not working, and quickly be able to make changes as I sort of went through this period of like really trying to get the tool to a point where I could start making on it. And once I got to that point of making, I think what has happened is that I sort of got um, caught up in the making. I was like, oh, now that I have this tool and I have this object, I got very caught up in very thinking of like, but what is this object? This object that, you know, the tool is assembled in different ways and I make on different ways. And then I have to sort of disassemble the tool to sort of extract this object. And I was sort of thinking about these different parts, but um, during my time here at Triangle, I've sort of, my understanding of the process of making has shifted, and I am sort of started to sort of think like, what is the important part in this making, and what is the true role of this object after the tool has been disassembled? And I've started to think about you know, what is the role of this object, and is the end result sort of this archive of this object as an archive of making, is that the important part, or is the process of making the important part? So I'm sort of at a point right now where I think I'm jumping ahead, but I think my time here is like really forced me to really look at and sort of recontextualize the making and really question, you know, the overall themes of what I keep thinking about with this work, is sort of like these ideas of culture, these ideas of expectation of culture, and sort of, you know, I thought at the beginning of my time here that, you know, the objects themselves, as I call them, like um, these objects have no orientation, in which they sort of operate in different ways and different as they operate in different ways. But you know, I you know, this questioning of culture, expectations of culture, and sort of the questioning of objects and objects in sort of the importance of objects. I'm starting to question, why is the end result important and not the making, and how does the making play, sort of how's the making situated in relation to the end object? And I'm at the begin I'm at the beginning of this thought. I'm really trying to figure out that part in this whole process of making, and this whole understanding of um, the malleability and the constant changing nature of culture, and the sort of how it's transformed subtly change in slow increments, like those things that I'm looking at. And when I'm looking at culture and trying to understand culture and how it's sort of transformed depending on where it's situated, I'm trying to understand how is that, and how's that informed in the way that I'm making. And I think looking, like trying to understand that during my time here, I think I was focused too much on the result of everything, like the aftermath of everything. And I've started to I've just started thinking about, you know, in the moment and in the making, and how that is more important than what happened, like the things that are left behind.
Going back to when you mentioned your process, and you mentioned tension, you know, and how that really changes the quality of your work, and how differently does, you know, that work look while being held, you know, taut on the loom, versus how does that ever, you know, change your perception of the work or create a new sort of dynamics there, like once it's taken off versus on?
I think, you know, when everything is being made on the loom, it's made on a very specific type of tension, and then it's sort of released from that tension once the loom is sort of disassembled. The tension on the loom is something that is necessary for the making, and the tension that happens once the object is released from the loom is necessary for its shaping. And I think that, you know, the tension that happens on the loom and sort of the decisions that happens while I'm weaving really is important to how the other part works, because a lot of the decisions that are made on the loom do not really come to fruition until that other form of tension is applied. And, you know, it's interesting how I'm sort of making in this very flat way and sort of expecting it through this different type of tension to sort of take up space and make shapes that sort of doesn't allow for a part to be, they're dimensional, so there's no true front to it. As when you think of traditional textiles and how textiles are made, there's, especially wovens, there's a front and a back. And through this making and through these different forms of tension, it doesn't allow that, because, you know, through the tool and how I make on the tool isn't something in which I sort of make on one side. Like I turn it around, I turn it like 90 degrees, and I just turn it around and I move it and I add pieces and I take away pieces. So, you know, when it's made in that tension, a lot of decisions are made, and it's made in a way that it doesn't have a true front. And then like once everything is removed and everything is sort of pulled and readjusted, it's sort of, it's this new tension allows for this object that, you know, I sort of start knowing with a general idea of what may happen, but during the making, I'm introducing all these different new tensions, and I'm moving the warp, and the warp is intersecting with different parts of it, and it's expanding and coming into itself. And, you know, through that tension, I'm able to sort of shift this understructure. But then, you know, once the tool is removed and that tension is removed, due to the decisions that I made during the weaving, I'm sort of able to sort of allow these objects to sort of take shape in new ways through a different type of understanding of tension, sort of the coming into itself and the sort of collapsing into itself to sort of form these shapes. So yeah.
And it's like a reevaluation and looking into all these aspects. And thank you so much for chatting with us today on your work and during the residency at Triangle. And thank you guys all for watching. And thank you guys.
Bye.